What kind of person are you? Not your job, not your beliefs, not the values you claim to hold. Something deeper than all of that. George Gurdjieff, one of the most enigmatic spiritual teachers of the 20th century, proposed that human beings are not at the same level of consciousness, and that this difference is not about intelligence, education, or morality. It is about something far more fundamental, the capacity for inner transformation. He described 4 types of human beings, and the most unsettling part, most of us carry elements of more than one. But before we meet these 4 types, a word about what Gurdjieff meant by the 4th way. Most spiritual traditions ask you to withdraw from the world, to become a monk, a hermit, an ascetic. The 4th way is different. It is a path of inner development that happens inside ordinary life, inside your work, your relationships, your daily obligations. No monastery required. The only requirement is self-observation and complete honesty about what you actually see. That context matters because the 4 types Gurdjieff describes are not philosophical abstractions. They are states you can recognize in the people around you and, more importantly, in yourself. But before we go further, I want to put something on the table here. Something I have arrived at after reading Plato, Heraclitus, the Pythagoreans, Iamblichus, and Gurdjieff side by side, together with Greek etymology. The standard account says Gurdjieff brought an Eastern teaching to the West, that he traveled through Central Asia, Persia, Tibet, gathered fragments of ancient wisdom from hidden brotherhoods and synthesized them into a new system. I no longer believe that is the whole story. In 529 AD, the Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens, the academy founded by Plato 9 centuries earlier, the Neoplatonic schools, all of them shut down by imperial decree. Their teachers scattered, their libraries were seized or destroyed. What was lost was not just a collection of texts. What was lost was something far harder to preserve. Philosophy as a living practice. Not philosophy as a set of ideas to be debated, but philosophy as a daily discipline of the self. Exercises, methods, ways of seeing, ways of moving through the world that were designed to actually change the person who practiced them. The French philosopher Pierre Hadot spent his life trying to recover this, what he called the spiritual exercises of antiquity. His conclusion was stark. Ancient philosophy was not primarily theoretical. It was therapeutic. It was transformative. It was, in every meaningful sense, a path. And then that path was closed. For over 1,000 years in the West, philosophy became almost exclusively what we call today academic. A discipline of argument and system building severed from the practical work of inner transformation. Now here is what I find impossible to ignore. Gurdjieff was a Pontic Greek, born in Alexandroupolis, raised in Karas, and he was a native speaker of Greek. The Pontic Greeks are among the oldest continuous Greek-speaking communities in the world, tradition that survived in the margins of empires, carrying fragments of something very old. When you read Gurdjieff alongside Heraclitus, the Logos, the sleeping man who thinks he is awake, the idea that most people live in a private dream, the overlap is not metaphorical, it is structural. When you look at the sacred movements, the choreographies Gurdjieff composed for his students designed to coordinate body, mind, and attention simultaneously, and then look at the cosmic dances of the Pontic tradition, which encode in physical movement a relationship between the human body and celestial order, you are looking at the same thing. When you trace his key concepts through Greek etymology, the word conscious, the word being, the word essence, the Greek roots do not merely translate, they illuminate. They suggest that the concepts were originally thought in Greek, not borrowed from Persian or Sanskrit. My conclusion, and I hold it as a considered position, not a certainty, is this. Gurdjieff did not bring an Eastern teaching to the West. He brought back a Greek teaching that the West had lost. And he dressed it in Eastern clothes, in the mystery, the exoticism, the Sufi brotherhoods and Tibetan monasteries, because that was the only packaging his era would receive. It was not deception, it was strategy. The same strategy Plato used when he put his most dangerous ideas in the mouth of Socrates, or wrapped them in myth. If this is true, and I believe it is, then what Gurdjieff is teaching is not foreign to the Western mind at all. It is the oldest layer of it, buried under 15 centuries of forgetting. With that in mind, let us now meet the four types. The first type is the householder. The name can be misleading. Gurdjieff does not mean someone boring, conventional, or spiritually asleep. He means something precise. A person who can be relied upon. The householder has basic values. A sense of responsibility. They think practically. They can maintain a commitment even when motivation fades. They understand, often instinctively, that meaningful results require sustained effort. In modern terms, you might say they have a high degree of psychological structure. And paradoxically, it is this ordinary quality, this groundedness, that Gurdjieff considers the only solid foundation for the path he called the fourth way. He was explicit about this. You cannot build inner work on chaos. You cannot sustain transformation without the ability to delay gratification, to tolerate discomfort, to follow through. The householder does not need to be enlightened. They do not need to be exceptional. They simply need to be someone who does what they say they will do. That, it turns out, is rarer than it sounds. The second type is the tramp. Not a tramp in the social sense, though the metaphor is intentional. The tramp is a person without inner structure, without direction, without a stable center of gravity. For the tramp, nothing truly matters. Values are fluid, shifting with mood and circumstance. Life feels disconnected, a series of random events with no deeper thread. The typical attitudes of the Tramp sound like this. Nothing really has meaning. Everything is relative anyway. There's no point in trying. Things just happen. There is no malice here. The Tramp is not dangerous in the way that other types can be. Their weakness is not cruelty, it is aimlessness. And that aimlessness becomes the obstacle. Because inner development requires sustained effort. It requires the ability to choose a direction and hold to it even when the feeling fades. The Tramp cannot do this, not because they lack intelligence, but because they have never built the inner axis that makes sustained effort possible. Gurdjieff's view was not hopeless about the Tramp, but he was honest. Transformation here requires far more than insight. It requires the slow and glamorous work of building structure from scratch. The third type is where things become genuinely dangerous. The lunatic. And before you picture someone erratic or obviously unhinged, stop. Because the lunatic, in Gurdjieff's teaching, can appear completely rational, educated, disciplined, even ideologically sophisticated. The problem is not a lack of conviction, it is the opposite. Gurdjieff describes the lunatic's thinking as formatory thinking, mechanical, rigid and absolute. It operates on fixed templates. It cannot hold nuance. It divides the world into clean categories, right and wrong, us and them, truth and heresy. And unlike the Tramp who drifts, the lunatic marches with complete certainty, with tremendous energy, toward conclusions that are fundamentally distorted. Think of the most confident people you have encountered who turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The ones who could not be reached by evidence, by argument, by human consequence. Their certainty was not a sign of understanding, it was a sign of the absence of it. This is what Gurdjieff is pointing at. Certainty without understanding is one of the most powerful engines of destruction in human history. The lunatic is not a lost cause, but correction here requires something radical. The willingness to question the very frameworks through which reality is being interpreted. And that kind of humility is almost impossible for someone convinced they already see clearly. And then there is the Hasnamuss. Gurdjieff invented this term himself. It does not translate neatly. But what it describes is specific and chilling. The Hasnamuss is not simply a bad person. A bad person can change. A bad person can feel guilt, make amends, and turn around. The Hasnamuss is something darker. A person who has crystallized irreversibly in a destructive direction. Someone who has destroyed within themselves the very mechanism by which transformation becomes possible. The characteristics Gurdjieff lists are stark. Extreme egocentrism, the complete absence of conscience, the ability to inflict suffering on others for personal gain, without internal resistance and a gravitational pull toward power. In modern language, we might reach for clinical terms: psychopathy, narcissistic personality disorder. But Gurdjieff's intention is deeper than psychology. He is describing an existential condition, kind of internal petrification. According to Uspensky, one of Gurdjieff's students, the householder can develop. The Tramp and the Lunatic may change under the right conditions. The Hasnamuss is beyond the reach of transformation. This is not judgment, it is a map. And like all maps, its purpose is to help us navigate, including navigating our own inner territory. But here is what makes this map genuinely uncomfortable. Gurdjieff did not say these are fixed categories, that you are born a householder and die one. He said they are states, fluid, shifting, sometimes cycling within a single day. The same person who wakes up with structure and purpose can spend an afternoon drifting like the Tramp, nothing quite mattering, motivation evaporating. The same person who usually questions themselves can, under pressure or ideology, suddenly march with the certainty of the lunatic. We are not one type, we are a mixture, and the mixture changes depending on sleep, stress, on what we have been feeding our attention. This is both the most sobering and the most hopeful part of the teaching. Sobering because you cannot simply identify yourself as a householder and relax. Hopeful because even if you recognize the Tramp or the lunatic operating inside you, that recognition itself is the beginning of something different. What makes this framework remarkable is that it is not original to the 20th century. 2,500 years ago, before Gurdjieff, Plato mapped almost exactly the same territory. In the Republic, Plato describes what he calls the divided line, 4 levels of cognition from the lowest to the highest. The first level is ikasia, living in illusions, mistaking shadows for reality. This is the world of the Tramp, lost in surface impressions with no stable ground beneath. The second is pistis, belief grounded in the sensory world. Practical, concrete, reliable. This is the householder, not enlightened, but real and stable enough to move from. The third is diania, rational thought, the use of concepts and logic. This corresponds to the lunatic, at their most recognizable. Someone who reasons systematically and confidently within a framework that is itself built on false premises. And the fourth, noesis, is direct intellectual insight into truth. The kind of understanding that cannot be faked, that cannot be inherited, that can only be arrived at through real inner work. The Hasnamuss has not simply failed to reach noesis, they have actually closed the door to it. They have made the ascent structurally impossible. So we have 2 traditions. 2 millennia apart. The same map, and that convergence is worth pausing on. But there is a third witness to this territory, and this one is older than Gurdjieff, older than the Republic. It is the Timaeus, one of Plato's most difficult dialogues, and in it, Plato does something remarkable. He describes what actually happens at a cosmic level to the soul that falls into the condition of the Hasnamuss. The Timaeus begins with a creation story. The demiurge, the divine craftsman, constructs the universe according to the model of eternal forms. And he fashions the human soul out of the same substance as the world soul, the rational order that governs the cosmos. Which means that the human soul, at its origin, is aligned with cosmic reason. Its natural movement mirrors the movement of the heavens, ordered, circular, and harmonious. But then something happens. The moment the soul enters the body, the moment it is born into matter, its revolutions are thrown into disorder. Plato is precise about this. The rational circles of the soul, which had moved in perfect alignment with the cosmos, are now battered by sensations, driven by appetites, pulled in contradictory directions. The soul that was once oriented upward loses its orientation entirely. For most people, this is temporary. Education, philosophy, the cultivation of reason, these can gradually restore the soul's original motion. The revolutions can be realigned. But for the person who chooses not to do this, who instead surrenders completely to appetite, to passion, to the pursuit of bodily pleasure and power, something far more serious occurs. Plato writes in the Timaeus, and this is the passage that should stop us in our tracks, that whoever devotes themselves excessively to lusts and conflicts becomes filled with opinions that are wholly mortal. He loses the immortal part of himself, not after death, but here in life, by his own choices. The appetitive part of the soul, Timaeus tells us, is like a wild beast. It cannot understand reason. It is not capable of it. It is entranced by images and visions, night and day, captivated by appearances, by surfaces, by immediate gratification. And when reason surrenders to this beast, not merely loses a battle, but is structurally enslaved by it. Then something irreversible occurs. Reason does not disappear, but it is redirected. Instead of seeking the genuinely good, it is forced to define as good whatever the lower part of the soul desires. The person still thinks, still reasons, still argues and justifies, but every faculty of thought has been conscripted in service of appetite. This is the enslavement of reason, and in Plato's view, it produces a profound and total ignorance about what actually has value. And then comes the passage that most modern readers skip over, the doctrine of reincarnation. At the end of the Timaeus, Plato describes what happens to the soul after death, and the progression is stark. Those who lived philosophically, who labored to realign their inner evolutions with the order of the cosmos, return to their star. They recover the life of pure contemplation that is their natural home. But those who failed in rational self-governance are reborn into progressively less rational forms, different grades of human life, then into animal bodies. The soul that has habituated itself to irrationality is pulled by its own accumulated character toward forms of existence that match that irrationality. Plato is careful here. He does not say this is punishment imposed from the outside. It is not divine judgment in any punitive sense. It is simply the consequence of what a soul has become. The reincarnation is the soul expressing its own nature, finding the form of existence that fits what it has made of itself. The Hasnamuss, in Platonic terms, has not simply failed to develop. He has, through repeated choices, shaped his soul into something that no longer fits a human form. Now place these two teachings side by side. Gurdjieff says the Hasnamuss has crystallized irreversibly in a destructive direction. The mechanism of transformation has been totally destroyed, not by external force, by the accumulated choices of a lifetime. Plato says the soul that surrenders entirely to appetite fills itself with wholly mortal opinions. Reason is enslaved. The immortal is forfeited in life, not in death. And the accumulated character of the soul then determines what form it takes next. Both traditions are describing the same mechanism, a progressive hardening, a narrowing, a slow substitution of the lower for the higher until the higher is no longer accessible. Not because it was taken away, but because it was abandoned, one choice at a time. The Timaeus makes one more point that Gurdjieff would recognize immediately. Ignorance in this framework is not simply a lack of information, it is a disease. Specifically, it is the disease of a soul that has lost its proper proportion, where the body has grown dominant over the intellect, where appetite has overrun reason, where the mortal has eclipsed the immortal. And like all disease, it did not arrive suddenly, it accumulated. What the Timaeus offers that neither Gurdjieff nor the Republic quite spells out in this way is a cosmological frame. The soul is not just a psychological fact. It is a fragment of cosmic order placed in a mortal body, pulled in two directions, toward the stars from which it came, or toward the earth that surrounds it. The householder in this frame is the person who has not yet been entirely pulled down, who still has enough structure to begin the ascent. The tramp drifts neither ascending nor descending with any direction. The lunatic moves with conviction, but in the wrong direction, deeper into the cave, mistaking the walls for windows. And the Hasnamuss, in the Timaeus, the answer is cosmological. A soul so thoroughly aligned with the mortal, the appetitive, the image, that it has effectively become what it has loved. 2,500 years separate Plato from Gurdjieff, and yet both arrived at the same threshold question. What are you making of yourself? Not in theory, not in aspiration, but in the actual texture of your choices day by day, hour by hour. What kind of soul are you slowly becoming? The purpose of this teaching is not to categorize other people. It is far more uncomfortable than that. It is an invitation to look inward, to notice your own mechanical reactions, the ones that run before you have consciously chosen them. To identify where your certainties might be more about structure than about truth. To see where motivation collapses, where values bend, where conscience goes quiet. Gurdjieff's final insight is this: inner development does not begin when a person adopts new beliefs. It does not begin with reading, or with agreement, or with inspiration. It begins when a person starts to observe, honestly, without flinching, the mechanical nature of their own reactions. So what does that actually look like? The Tramp inside you speaks when nothing feels worth the effort, when you postpone, justify, drift. When the thought appears, what's the point anyway? The lunatic inside you speaks when you stop questioning, when a belief feels so obviously correct that examining it seems like a waste of time, when you find yourself arguing not to find truth but to win. The Hasnamuss tendency shows itself more quietly in the moments when you know something is wrong and choose it anyway, not out of weakness but out of indifference. When conscience whispers and you have learned to not hear it. And the householder? That is the part of you that shows up, that keeps the commitment when the feeling has gone, that does the thing because it said it would. The question is not which type you are. The question is which voice you are listening to right now, today, in the choices that nobody else sees. That observation is the first real step. Everything else follows from it.